I'm a quantitative sociologist, and so everything I do is data driven, and I spend a lot of time in front of a screen looking at numbers. And then I met, and most of the work that I do is on incarceration, recidivism, sentencing patterns, and I started focusing in on extreme sentences in Louisiana to try to understand why it is that we are leading the nation. And really it comes down to excessive sentences. It's not, when you start taking all these other pieces away of the puzzle, we have a fifth of all folks who are incarcerated in Louisiana serving 20 years or more. That's higher than any other place, certainly in the South. I always use the South as comparison states because certainly with respect to advocacy, nobody really in Louisiana is moved by what's happening in California. So we try to keep it here. But then, so I had all this amazing data on incredibly low recidivism rates for folks who have served, a couple to 3 decades in prison when they come home. And I couldn't understand why people weren't more moved by the data. And then I met this man who some of you may have come across, named Calvin Duncan, who was released from prison after serving 28 and a half years with the help from the Innocence Project. And while he was at Angola, he served as inmate counsel. And in that capacity, really got to know some of these men a little bit better than if they're just in the dorm together. And I was showing him all this data, and he was not surprised at all, because he had grown up with most of these folks. He knew the people behind these numbers, and had watched them go through these significant changes as we age. Age is the most powerful predictor of reoffending. And so he wasn't surprised by all of that. And so we were trying to figure out, well, how do we get this out? Because nobody's really responding to the data. And then I realized that, people don't make empathetic connections to data points. They make empathetic connections to people and their stories. And so Calvin and I decided we needed to find a way to get these stories out. And so I abandoned my quantitative hat and put on an ethnography hat. We got permission to go into Angola. I ended up filming 150 filmed oral history interviews. Once I got the access, I was only going to go in there with a field recorder, and once I got in, I realized this is an amazing opportunity. We need to get these stories out. And the result was this project called the Visiting Room Project. I also went into the women's prison because they're always ignored, and I interviewed about 50 women there serving life sentences. And so that's the project that we're working on right now with the editing. So I'm going to try to go through this, and I can also refer you to this. There's it's up here. I can actually send you a copy of this or send it to Professor Lewis. We can figure something out. But Professor Armstrong at Loyola's Law School and I worked on a massive data landscape project looking at everything from pretrial incarceration data, reentry data, and it's a publication from the Public Welfare Foundation that has much more data than anybody could go through in one day. But it's a fairly good resource for every aspect of the criminal legal system in Louisiana, including juvenile justice as well. So a lot of the numbers that I'm going to go through with you today come from that original project. I just sort of reworked them here. So Louisiana and southern states. So I've got Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Oklahoma. Okay, so one of the things that I've stopped doing is when we look at race in the criminal legal system in Louisiana, the first time I started looking at these things about 20 years ago, I was just shocked. And over time, I'm trying not to go down that slippery slope of going, well, what do you expect? It's Louisiana. I think that outrage is important. And I go over these things, and I think people have very little idea just how alarming the disparities are. We understand there's a little, but when you actually look at the numbers and the ratios, so what I've done for all of the data So when they calculate incarceration rates for black folks and white folks, they use the general population. They look at the incarceration rate, they divide it by the population, they multiply by 100,000 to get a factor. You get really misleading information that way. I have calculated all of my data by looking at not only states but then individual parish level data for all 64 parishes that looks at the incarceration rate, the black incarceration rate per 100,000 black residents. That's the way we ought to be looking at it. Similarly, for New Orleans, it could skew the other way if you have a majority-minority city or parish. So anyway, if we look at this data, what you see is that Louisiana is the leader in overall incarceration rates. It is the leader, not quite the leader for white incarceration rates. That goes to Oklahoma. For the black incarceration rate, we're right up there. The overall incarceration rate is high, and the racial disparities are 4 to 1. So 4 black folks are incarcerated for every one white person in this state. That's actually fairly common in the South, so we're not an outlier in that way. But we are now leading the nation in incarceration. So what's driving this? This is the thing that requires a lot of work to sort of figure out what's causing it, right? Because we have so many things going on at once, we're unable to control in an experimental fashion for what's driving our issues here. So you really have to actually go outside of Louisiana and look and see what's happening in other places. So where you have other states with really high incarceration, what are the driving factors there? You've got to look at all of the research that we can put together on this. In my view, I've concluded that there are 3 things that we have that are really driving this issue. And unfortunately, when I realized that I had an invitation to speak to judges across Louisiana, one of the things that I realized when I was putting this together is that judges have very little discretion to do anything about these things, these major driving factors. There are some, my understanding is there are some situations where judges can refuse, for example, a habitual offender enhancement penalty, or in fact, if they believe that it's an unconstitutional sentence. But that's very, very rare. And so essentially, these things are being driven by prosecutors. And judges very rarely, you see, impose some kind of downward departure for whatever a prosecutor is bringing to them. And so where it goes there is like the legislature, but the legislature is informed by judges. So these conversations, there's still a massive role for judges to play in this. Mandatory sentencing schemes is a major, major driver behind our problem. Mandatory life without parole for all kinds of offenses is another driver. We have, and I'll show you this, we'll get to life without parole a little bit later, but we lead the nation by far in terms of the percentage of people who are incarcerated in our prisons who are serving a life without parole sentence. There's one other state that's close behind, so I'll show you this in a minute, but about 16 to 17% of all people who are incarcerated in Louisiana are serving a life without parole sentence. Now, if you're thinking about what's driving incarceration rate, well, then none of them are coming home. So that's that stable population that's as opposed to the turnstile. There's one other state that comes a little bit close. It's at 12%, and everybody else is way down 1%, 2%. And that other state is Pennsylvania. And we don't have very much in common with Pennsylvania, but we do have one thing in common. We both have mandatory life without parole for second-degree murder. Those mandatory sentencing schemes take discretion away from judges, away from juries, the folks that we elect and entrust, and who are acting in our name, in our collective name, and yet we have no way of changing this scheme. That's one of the drivers. Now, by the way, I should say up front, I'm a sociologist. I'm not a philosopher or an ethicist. Sociology and social science cannot address the morality of anything. I cannot here tell you empirically this is an excessive punishment. But I can say, well, look, let's compare it with what other folks are doing. I can show you all of the data on recidivism and public safety and costs and all of it, and then you decide the moral aspects of it, right? As we all do. Of course, I have this moral compass that I have my own reaction to, but it's not my view on that is not empirically or scientifically more valid than anybody else's. But I can at least point out what's going on, and then the rest of us can decide, do we want to keep doing this? Restrictions on good time for crimes of violence. I think you had a presentation by Secretary LeBlanc on the justice reinvestment efforts. All of those efforts excluded crimes of violence from sentencing reform. Prosecutorial decision to invoke habitual offender penalty enhancements. That's another major driver. There's also, it's not a major driver, but there is also, we have lots of folks, juveniles, who are charged and treated as adults, much more than our neighboring states. And we also, this is a difficult thing to get data on, but anecdotally we're seeing lots of cases that are being re-examined where they are clearly upcharging cases. So a manslaughter case upcharged a second-degree murder, and of course the difference then, the impact on incarceration is enormous because that's a mandatory life sentence. These are the three things that I see. So mandatory sentencing schemes, including life without parole, restrictions on good time for crimes of violence, and of course always excluding, taking them off the table during any kind of reform effort, and then prosecutorial decisions about habitual offenders. I don't want to suggest that juveniles tried as adults are driving this. It's not driving the numbers, but it is happening. And then when you start to bury down a little bit further, get away from the state comparisons and start looking at parishes, it's a few parishes that are driving all of this. And I'm not familiar with all of you and where you're practicing, but a third of the incarcerated population come from 3 parishes. And you probably could guess them, right? Even if you can't read this slide. Orleans, Jefferson, East Baton Rouge. Half of all prisoners serving life without parole were convicted in 4. The Trinity here, Orleans, Jefferson, and East Baton Rouge, and then also Caddo. These same 4 parishes account for half of all juvenile offenders who are tried as adults. That's a prosecutorial discretion issue. So the same 4. And then half of all prisoners charged with the habitual offender statute, 50%, come from 2 parishes, Orleans and Jefferson. Now we know what's happening in Orleans. It's actually a rather grand experiment that I'm tracking all of the data for. But if it comes down to it, if 2 prosecutors just change their practices, it would impact more than half of that population. Sometimes that's a source of hope for me because that's something that you can do, right? Now, I'm biased. I think that in most cases habitual offender statutes are excessive. But if we decide we do want a downward departure from the use of the habitual offender statutes, it really is 2 places, and one of them's already changed. So those are the driving parishes. Again, it's unfortunate. I spent a lot of time putting this together to show you, but these are the 10 most populous parishes in Louisiana. So it's East Baton Rouge, Jefferson, Orleans, St. Tammany, Lafayette, Caddo, Calcasieu, Ouachita, Livingston, and Tangipahoa. And what I've done here is I've just looked at the number of incarcerated people, the incarceration rate overall, and then the highlights. Orleans has the highest of all of those. That's 1,000 per 100,000 New Orleans residents that are incarcerated. The percent of the population of the parish that is black, because again that's something that we want to factor into, because race, you cannot escape race with any of this. And then the white incarceration rate, the black incarceration rate, and then the ratio of black to white. The highest disparities are in Orleans, almost 8 to 1. Now I'm not. This is controlling for the population, so it's controlling for the fact that New Orleans has 60% of the population is black. That's outrageous. If it was cancer or some other thing, we would all be in an uproar. But there's times you say, oh yeah, well we're in Orleans, we're in the South, it's Louisiana. That's just not good enough.